Good morning, dear colleagues, dear fellows and experts. Hope you're all well rested. And today we have a wonderful presentation to start with. It's a great honor to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Hanna Notte, who's the director of the Eurasia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, CNS, and senior associate in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. Her work focuses on Russia's foreign, arms control and non-proliferation policies, Russia's relations with the global south and Middle East in particular, Russian military innovation and arms control and non-proliferation in the Middle East. Her contributions have appeared in the Non-Proliferation Review, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and War on the Rocks, among others. She's also the author of Death Dust, The Rise, Demise and Future of Radiological Weapons Programs, which was published with Stanford University Press in 2023. Notte joined CNS in 2020 and worked for its European branch, the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation from 2021 to 2023. And previously, Dr. Notte worked with the Scheik Group, an NGO focused on informal diplomacy in Middle East conflicts, supporting its engagement with Russia. And she was a visiting researcher in 2015-2016 with the Institute of Oriental Studies, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the Carnegie Moscow Center. She's also proficient in Russian and Arabic and based in Berlin. And also, Hanna Notte is an alumna of the MSSR. Is the first MSSR is...
I was just trying to count. I think the first program was 2017, right? Exactly. I've been part of every MSSR over the last 8 years, which is pretty nice.
It's so wonderful to have you again with us, continuing the tradition. So, Hanna, over to you.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Yes, I was just counting, and it doesn't seem like it's been eight years coming to the program, but actually it is, which is quite wow. Time passes. It's very nice to be here. I was in Yerevan last summer as well, sitting in the same room talking to the students, and it's great to be back. And what I wanted to talk about in this rather early morning to wake us all up is about Russia and the Middle East, which is a topic I've been working on for much of the past decade through my PhD, and then in mediation on mostly the Syrian conflict, working with the Russian side between 2017 and 2020 on that conflict, and then more recently in my job as a think tanker. And if we go to the first slide, what I wanted to do for the next, 30 to 40 minutes or so is just look at Russian interest in the Middle East from the early 2000s under President Putin, and then focus a little bit on what has changed since the war in Ukraine started some 2.5 years ago now, and perhaps even more in light of October 7th and in the context of the current Gaza war. If we go to the next slide, what I wanted to sort of start by saying is that if you look at the years leading up to the war in Ukraine, and look at actually Russian official rhetoric, there was relatively little focus still in official documents on the Middle East. If you look at the 2016 foreign policy concept, it's really just providing scant mention of the region. If you compare it to how Russia treats the post-Soviet states, the United States, China, the Arctic, the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region doesn't sort of make it up to the list of priorities. The same, if we go to the next slide, applies to the 2021 National Security Strategy, where it takes up to paragraph 37 to even find a mention of the region. And that somewhat stands in contrast, if we go to the next slide, to the de facto growing significance of the Middle East to Russian foreign policy. Russia intervened, as you know, in the Syrian conflict in September 2015. It became increasingly active in Libya from 2017, 2018, and we ended up with a situation in the last few years where Russia de facto had a presence at almost every table, at every regional conflict, as a voice to speak with. Russia was a significant provider of weapons to diverse Middle Eastern countries, especially its old partners with which it had legacy relationships dating back to the Soviet time. And here I talk specifically about Iraq, but also Syria, Egypt, Algeria, a major importer of Russian arms. And if we look at the sort of period from 2015 onwards, 2015 being the year that Russia intervened in Syria, you see this explosion of sheer Russian diplomatic activity in the region. I think at one point I looked at the number of meetings that Lavrov held with regional counterparts from 2010 to 2015, and then 2015 to 2020, and you see, I think, more than a doubling of meetings. And I think that shift, that growing activity had to do with Russia's involvement in the Syrian war, which mandated or demanded, and I'll go into this a little bit more deeply, a lot of diplomatic interaction with different parties that became involved in the Syrian conflict: Turkey, the Syrian Kurds, Iran, Israel, the Gulf states. But this growing interest in the region, I think, also had to do more generally with a shift in Russian foreign policy over that decade. Russia viewing the world as increasingly multipolar, finding itself in a confrontation with the West increasingly, with the United States, and believing in the need to diversify relations. And so within that worldview, I think the MENA region very understandably occupied an important place because of the legacy of the Soviet Union in that region. From the late 1950s in the Cold War, the Soviet Union had developed very close ties with the Arab nationalist states, so Egypt, Syria, and Iraq first and foremost, but then also to some extent Algeria, Sudan, northern Yemen, and Libya. It had a military presence in the region, so there was something to work with. I mean, the Russians still had their military, their port in Tartus in Syria when they intervened in 2015. So unlike some other regions in the world where Russia didn't have that kind of presence or legacy to draw back upon, the Middle East was a different story. And so I think it's only natural that you see that increased focus on the region. Now, having said all that, I want to quickly sort of go through the interest that Russia pursued in the region through the 2000s and 2010s to sort of give us a background. I view Russian security interests as always having trumped economic or other interests in the region. And here I would distinguish between two dimensions. There's been a long-standing Russian interest to put it bluntly, to keep bad things away from the region affecting the Russian Federation. Instability, extremism, terrorism, centrifugal tendencies emanating from the region that could destabilize Russia or its neighborhood. I think you see this already in the context of the Chechen wars, certainly the Second Chechen War and terrorist attacks in the Russian Federation in the early 2000s, where there was a fear that forces from not just Afghanistan, and Russia made a very close link between Afghanistan and the Second Chechen War, alleging that Chechen rebels were receiving support from Afghanistan, but also to some extent being supported by extremist forces in the Middle East. You see that link being made. That became even more important in the context of the Arab Spring from 2011. So the fear that extremist forces in the Middle East could support forces in the North Caucasus. You see it later again in the context of the Syrian war, where actually you have quite a sizable number of individuals from the North Caucasus and actually other parts of Russia joining various groups in the Syrian jihad, not just the Islamic State, but also before that Al-Qaeda, and a worry that these individuals might come back and cause problems inside Russia. So this sort of the nexus a bit between the Middle East and Russia when it comes to extremism or terrorism, I think that's a long-standing concern. And then related to that, Russia has long held that it's concerned with what I call here on the slide state order in the Middle East. Russia was aggrieved by how the West responded to the Arab Spring from 2011, sort of jumping on this bandwagon of supporting democratic movements in the region, viewing that as a sort of social political engineering, as an intrusion into the social fabric of those countries in the Middle East. Russia has essentially held that these states in the region, they are fairly young by comparative standards, if you compare this with statehood in Europe, for example, and that leaders have for a long time tried to balance very carefully between Islam on the one hand and tribal relations on the other. And that has been always a very precarious balance. And that you can't then come in from the outside, which Russia alleged Western states did in the context of the Arab Spring, and sort of try to fuel social or political change too fast. I remember, when I was working on the Syrian conflict in this track 2, diplomacy and mediation, we would regularly convene Syrian opposition of various kinds. We would also engage with individuals closer to the Syrian regime. We would engage them in these dialogues in Turkey, in Beirut, sometimes in European countries. And we would try to come up with ideas to move the political process forward. And then we would take those ideas and try to engage the Russian side. Because, of course, Russia was an important party by that point in the Syrian war, and it was one of the interlocutors who you needed to convince of those ideas. So I remember regular conversations in Moscow at the Russian Foreign Ministry with diplomats who were working the Middle Eastern file and Syria in particular. And we would come there with these ideas, maybe you try this to move the transitional process forward or that. And they would always look at us somewhat with a bit of bewilderment and sort of say, these ideas are not viable. We don't really understand what you're talking about. And I still remember this one conversation with a Russian diplomat who had worked on Syria for a long time. And he just said to me, look, it's like very simple. Statehood in the Middle East is like a Mercedes engine. It's a very complicated, intricate thing. You can take it apart quite easily. You can do that. But then good luck to you trying to put it back together. You're not going to manage to do that. This is how statehood works in the Middle East. And you Western countries, you came and you took the engine apart. And now look at the state that the region is in. Look at where Libya is after 2011. Look at where Syria is. This is sort of how Russian diplomats, in my experience at least, have looked at Western policy in the context of the Arab Spring, and have sort of pushed back against this notion of, promoting the kind of change I think that Western diplomacy hoped to foster. So I think it is true that Russia was also reluctant to see, this kind of change, which in the Syrian case, in Libya, it did result in regime change, which I think is a long-standing grievance of Russian diplomacy. Under President Medvedev, Russia abstaining from the Security Council Resolution 1973 in 2011, and then seeing the fall of Gaddafi some months later. It was adamant that this same scenario was not going to be repeated in Syria. Now, I do believe that part of that reason is that these are Russia's allies, that Russia has a presence in that country and influence to protect. So there was a sort of naked realpolitik interest in supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad. But I do at the same time also think that Russian diplomats genuinely think or believe that what Western diplomacy tried to achieve in the region wasn't viable or realistic. I guess these two narratives are not mutually exclusive. I also think that, and actually dating back to the mid-2000s, there was this concern in Moscow, and it became more acute with the Arab Spring, that Western policy fostering so-called quote-unquote color revolutions in the Middle East was some sort of dress rehearsal for enacting the same kind of change in Russia's neighborhood. I think even if you go back to 2005 and the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, which ended the Syrian presence there, and you look at Russian commentary, and this is now almost 20 years ago, you already see certain voices saying, the West is meddling there, let's just wait and see what they're going to do in our neighborhood. And of course, this is at the time where you already had the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. And again, that narrative becomes more acute with the Arab Spring, this idea that Western policy is doing one thing in the Middle East and the same thing might happen in Russia's neighborhood. So I think all these different prisms sort of combine to explain Russian security interests in the region over the last 2 decades, broadly speaking, There is then, if we go back to the previous slide, a more recent security interest that is added onto this. The Russians intervened in Syria in 2015, and then they invested quite a lot to upgrade their security presence in the country with the airbase at Hmeimim and the port at Tartus. Quite significant upgrades that enabled them to deploy more significant capabilities to Syria. And so what you see with the aggravation in Russia-West relations over the years is Russia increasingly using its presence in Syria to also send signals to NATO to say, we here, we can cause you trouble in this part of the world. We can send certain signals to you if we are displeased with your policy elsewhere. So you see a more muscular approach by Russia in Syria over the years to send that kind of signal to the West. So sort of an instrumentalization of Russia's security presence for reasons that have nothing to do with the Middle East, but for the broader confrontation with the West. I do quickly want to run through the economic interests, which to my mind have for a long time been secondary. So when there was maybe a contradiction between a security interest and an economic interest, security interests usually take precedence in Russian decision-making. But broadly speaking, the most significant interests that Russia has pursued in the region were the arms sales, which were quite significant until 2022, and that is somewhat changing against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, and we can talk about why that is the case. Russia is building nuclear power plants in the region. The Akuyu plant in Turkey, which is not strictly speaking part of the Middle East, but nonetheless. Russia is also building a nuclear power plant in El Daba in the Egyptian desert, and it has a lot of MOUs with other countries in the Middle East to move into the civilian nuclear power space. Of course, Rosatom has been working on the Bushehr reactor in Iran for a long period of time. So this is definitely a great area of interest for Russia, and I'd say Rosatom is, if anything, becoming a more important economic player for Russia in recent years. Grain exports, a lot of Middle Eastern countries have been highly dependent on both Russia and Ukraine for wheat and other agricultural exports. There was quite a bit of, and I think there still is quite a bit of tourism with Russian tourists, especially going to Egypt. That has been a significant factor, and you saw, I think it was in, was it November 2015 when the Russian passenger plane was downed over the Sinai and there was the breakdown and sort of Russian tourists stopped going to Egypt for some time, and that needed sorting out between Cairo and Moscow. I think that was quite, it was not insignificant for the Egyptian economy, and the Egyptians were very keen to get that tourism back on track. When it comes to energy, of course, Russia itself, one of the largest crude oil and gas producers in the world, highly dependent on resource exports, is somewhat of a competitor to countries in the MENA region, which themselves are important exporters of oil. But what you have seen in recent years is Russian companies like Rosneft, like Lukoil, but also Gazprom, partnering with regional countries to sort of get a foothold both in exploration and development of hydrocarbon resources, to have somewhat of leverage also over the export decisions of those countries. So you see Rosneft and Lukoil very much present in Iraq, to some extent trying to move back into Libya, though the security situation still doesn't allow that. Partnerships with countries like Lebanon. And then, of course, extremely important for Russia, and I think a major factor still explaining how Russia navigates the region right now is its partnership in OPEC+, in particular with Saudi Arabia, coordinating and aligning with these countries to have leverage over the oil price. Finally, financial ties, the Russian Federation over the last 30 years has not been a financial player in the region. It hasn't had the cash to invest in these countries in the region. What Russia has done is forgive certain Soviet-era debt to some of its partners in the region, like Iraq, like Syria, some others. But it's mostly tried to attract investment from Gulf countries into the Russian Federation. And that, I would say, with a mixed success. I think there was a lot of talk over many years of attracting Saudi investment in the Russian economy, but a feeling that there was always more talk than action, whereas Qatari investment, I think, has been considered more significant. And then the final point I would make is that besides these security and economic interests, there's also, I think, been this ambition in Russian foreign policy, again, building on what Russia sees as a very successful intervention in Syria. Bashar al-Assad came out on top. Russia navigated quite successfully between these different mutually antagonistic players that were involved in, or that are still involved in the Syrian conflict. This idea that Russia has something to offer by way of promoting regional order, that it can offer an alternative to US or Western approaches to the region, partially to underscore its claim to great power status. So you see this on other regional dossiers. For example, the Russians have for years put forward a concept for security in the Persian Gulf to mediate between Iran and its neighbors. Russia has pretensions to be a major power in the Israel-Palestine conflict, priding itself on its original role in the Middle East Quartet, which is now largely dormant, but over the last few years bemoaning what Russia calls the US monopolization of the peace process that happened certainly under the Trump administration. So sort of, laying claim to that and saying, actually, we have a more viable approach to offer to the region. And I think perhaps related to that, Russian discourse on standing for certain conservative values. I think it was at the Valdai in 2021, so some months before the Ukraine invasion, where Putin promulgated that Russia stands for a quote-unquote healthy conservatism. Of course, that kind of discourse has also resonated, at least in some parts of the Middle East, where Russia has also portrayed itself as the protector and guarantor of the rights of religious minorities. One final thing I'll say, if we go to the next slide, is that we can talk about different means that Russia has had at its disposal to pursue its interests in the Middle East, economic statecraft, the growing role of Rosatrudnichestva to project soft power into the region. But to me, a key factor in explaining Russia's approach to the region, and one that it has pursued quite successfully over the years, is Russia's regional balancing acts. So this ability or desire to navigate between these different mutually antagonistic players in the region, mediate between them when possible, but always make sure that you damage relations with neither side. I think this has been sort of a hallmark of Russian diplomacy in the Middle East over the years. If we think about the Syrian conflict alone, Russia navigated between the Syrian regime and the opposition. We sort of routinely think of Russia as a power that has protected the Assad regime. That's true. But if you look at over the years, Russia has engaged various stripes of Syrian opposition very actively. So it's tried to navigate between those two, between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds, between Turkey and Iran in the Astana format, which was quite a significant, I think, feat of Russian diplomacy to engage with Turkey in that way, and a NATO ally at the end of the day. And then between Israel and Iran over the years. I mean, the Israelis have, I think since 2017, 2018, taken significant military action against the Iranian proxy presence in Syria. Russia established a deconfliction mechanism with the Israelis, which worked for the most part. I guess at one point, the Israelis inadvertently downed an Aleutian plane. That was the only serious incident to date. So that has been quite significant. It's not just the case in the Syrian conflict, but also trying to balance between Israel and the Palestinians over the years, between different actors on opposing sides in the Libyan conflict. Even within the Gulf, you remember that there was a blockade of Qatar some years ago. The other Gulf states, Gulf Cooperation Council states, moving against Qatar. If you look at Russian diplomacy during that episode, they very much try to stay on good terms with all sides, not pick a side, essentially, in that conflict. Now I want to maybe use the next 10 minutes or so to talk about what's changed. And I would perhaps start by arguing to you that since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, I don't think that Russia's fundamental interests in the MENA region, as I just outlined them to you, have changed. I think they have by and large stayed the same. Russia's regional presence has by and large stayed the same. I mean, there have been some redeployments from Syria to Ukraine in the early phase of the war in terms of military hardware. But, you know, the Russian presence in terms of troop numbers was already fairly manageable by 2022 because active combat activities had largely died down. And the Russians are still very much keeping that presence in Syria. If anything, perhaps the MENA region has become even more important to Russia in light of this harsh decoupling that we've seen between Russia and the West. Russia as an economic player, there have been some shifts, like Russian arms sales to the region we see really going down now. I don't think any deal concluded with the Egyptians since 2022. That might be to some extent a function of reduced Russian bandwidth. There's a question over the extent to which Russia can produce high-end systems like fighter jets for export at a time when its defense industry is very much focused on producing for the war effort in Ukraine. There's also the question over the extent to which the threat of US CAATSA sanctions is deterring countries in the region from buying from Russia. Probably it's a story where these factors all play a role, but we really see Russian arms sales going down to the region. Rosatom, on the other hand, still very much active. Coordination with OPEC Plus, very much active. President Putin was in Saudi Arabia and the UAE this past December. And Russia is very much trying to advance the North-South corridor in order to get that route through Iran to the Indian Ocean, open up new trade routes. I think that is gaining new significance for Russia. I think an important thing that has changed, and we can discuss this more, is that Russia has somewhat lost leverage over two key middle powers that have a lot of leverage over different files in the Middle East, and those are Iran and Turkey. Growing dependence on Iran, from which Russia has procured drones and other military support for the war in Ukraine, and it has become more reliant on Turkey for trade relations as well. And so you see that reduced leverage sort of episodically. For example, in 2022, in the summer, a few months into the war in Ukraine, there was a real threat of renewed Turkish military action in northern Syria. They were really flexing their muscles. And Russia was very subdued in how it reacted to that episode, which was sort of indicative of a certain Russian caution vis-a-vis Turkey. And I suppose we could, you could have a different debate as to how Russia has navigated this region and the conflict here in the South Caucasus, and to what extent that is also a function of a more cautious stance vis-a-vis Turkey. And then another interesting trend, which I'm sort of just putting on the slide, which we're not going to talk about in detail, is, there's a lot of focus now in Russia on Africa. I wouldn't say that it comes to the detriment of focus on the Middle East, but, the Middle East is an area where the Russians have been very active for over a decade now. They've established many relationships. They have sort of a solid presence, which they cannot really expand either, at least militarily. It's not that Russia can realistically move into other countries in the Middle East to establish a military presence. But in Africa, we see some shifts. I think we see a greater desire to make the presence that Russia has in Libya, for example, formerly PMC Wagner, actually into an official presence, moving away from plausible deniability to actually say, we are officially here. We see Russia's push into the Sahel region, and I think more generally a growing focus on the African continent as one that is demographically and economically attractive to Russia. But I want to move to the next slide and talk about what I see as sort of two key trends when I look at how Russia is navigating in the Middle East against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine. And the first thing I would pose to you is that confrontation with the West over Ukraine which the Russian Federation sees as existential for itself, has become the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy. And that is also affecting how Russia now approaches everything in the Middle East. Up until February 2022, we had a situation where Russia, notwithstanding, growing friction with the West and different approaches to these regional conflicts, as I outlined, was willing to cooperate with Western states selectively on different dossiers. On Syria, for example, you had convergence on the UN Security Council when it came to humanitarian assistance to Syria's northwest, Idlib province. You still had cooperation on the Iranian nuclear dossier, Russia actually being quite active leading up to 2022 when it came to efforts to restore the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. A year before the war in Ukraine started, the Biden administration comes into office in early 2021, quite willing to return into the JCPOA, from which President Trump had withdrawn the United States in May 2018. And in that year, 2021 up until 2022, Russian diplomacy is very active to support that effort, led by the Russian mission in Vienna. That is, I would argue, falling by the wayside once we get to spring 2022. So Russia no longer being so interested in working with Western counterparts to restore the nuclear deal. And then certainly since October 7th and the war in Gaza, I think what you see Russia effectively doing is moving somewhat away from that policy of balancing acts that I outlined and that I think was a hallmark of Russia's approach to the region for the longest time, with Russia adopting a quite forward-leaning pro-Palestinian stance on the crisis, being very critical of Israel. I wouldn't say that this is completely surprising or, without any kind of historical basis, because if you look at Russian foreign policy historically, an affinity for the Palestinians, a certain closeness to the Palestinian cause, I think is there historically, going back to Soviet times. And Hamas has frequented Moscow since they came to power in the Gaza Strip since 2006. And Russia has been active over the years with intra-Palestinian mediation, organizing these different meetings in Moscow. So the fact that Russia is doing this now is not without historical precedent. But I think if you look at Russia's positioning during previous rounds of conflict, the Second Intifada, the 2014 Gaza war, there was a greater even-handedness in how Russian diplomacy would comment on those issues, whereas now you really see sort of Russia going out of its way on the UN Security Council and its media messaging to take a very critical and harsh stance on Israel. Russia has hosted, I think, Hamas delegations now 4 times since October 7th. It's hosted the Houthis in Moscow. So there is this view, and this comes to my next point, that against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine and with confrontation with the United States of taking precedence over other concerns, we now see a growing Russian tilt towards anti-Western forces in the region, and in particular towards the axis of resistance, by which I mean Iran and its partners and proxies in the region. You had Russian contacts with these Iranian proxies and partners, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Iraqi and Shia militias, episodically and periodically in the years leading up to this. I mentioned Hamas going to Moscow since 2006, contacts with Hezbollah were essential for Russia, even navigating the Syrian landscape since 2015, because Hezbollah was militarily present on the ground. But the engagement was very sporadic, because I would say that there's been a Russian resistance to view armed non-state actors in the region as sort of primary interlocutors. Russia is more comfortable dealing with states than with non-state actors. Now you see somewhat greater diplomatic and rhetorical support for these partners, and there are greater indications, perhaps, that Russia is also willing to give security assistance to those kinds of groups. You've got the odd anti-tank missile system or weapon showing up in the arsenal of Hezbollah or some of these other players that are Russian origin. But I don't think there's any evidence to say that there's, any kind of systematic security assistance by Russia to these groups. And certainly, these claims on October 7th or shortly thereafter that there was any evidence that Russia had put Hamas up to this or that Russia had given Hamas weapons, I haven't seen any credible evidence to the effect that that is actually true. If we go to the next slide, I'll just end with this, 2 more minutes. In the early 90s, when Russia was kind of really almost out and down in the Middle East, and it had to sort of regain its foothold in the Middle East, a very prominent Russian Arabist and Africanist, Alexei Vasilyev from the Russian Academy of Sciences, he wrote that with Russia entering the 90s and the Cold War having ended, Russian policy in the region had rid itself of a pro-complex. Henceforth, it would be neither pro-Arab, it also wouldn't be pro-American, it would only serve its own interests, and it will prefer to gamble on more than one horse. And I think the big question for me, as someone looking at Russia in the region, is to what extent Russia will manage and still be willing to maintain those balancing acts in the region and not have a pro-complex. I think there is now indication and evidence that it is tilting more towards the anti-Western forces in the region, given the geopolitical backdrop against which Russian foreign policy in the Middle East is crystallizing. But I think that Russia is not going to go sort of too far into this direction either. It still cares very much about its ties to the Arab states. It needs the Arab states for economic reasons. We can talk about Russia-Israel relations, which are really at a very low point now. But even here, I don't think Moscow has any interest in a full severing of ties with Israel. The big question to me now, looking at what's happening in the region on a day-to-day basis, is what will the Russians do if conflict escalates further? We are now, 8 months into the war in Gaza. There's this summer a real concern over war between Israel and Hezbollah, possibly a conflict that could escalate to the level of Israel versus Iran. And the question to me is, if things move into that direction, let's say there is a war between Israel and Hezbollah, and the United States comes in and supports Israel, what would the Russian Federation do in that kind of situation? I don't think Russia has the bandwidth or desire to really get militarily involved in a war in the Middle East. They cannot do that, and they do not want to do that. But what would they do in order to support their partners in the region in that kind of scenario? I think that's a question worth asking. And more generally, looking at the region, what I find very worrisome, coming back to this idea that confrontation is now the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy in the Middle East, and that we're no longer seeing this compartmentalization of nuclear non-proliferation. We can also talk about counterterrorism, is that we're now moving into a period, I think, where the threats on which the United States or Western states and Russia used to cooperate in the region, nuclear proliferation, counterterrorism, that I don't see on the horizon that cooperation will be possible. And so, in light of the Crocus City Hall attacks in Moscow and perhaps a resurgence in the threat posed by the Islamic State, but also a creeping nuclearization in the Middle East, I'm not very optimistic that we'll see a lot of cooperation between Russia and Western countries on those issues. Perhaps I'll end here and happy to take questions.